Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Geeking Out podcast. This week is going to be a little bit different. Last several editions of this, with the exception of the first four episodes, have been more so interviews with artists and writers and personalities in this area or from just kind of promoting the geek culture scene. Uh, this is going to be more of a retrospective and of the independent wrestling scene in the St. Louis area. I'm joined this week by my friend Patrick Brandmeyer. Patrick has been part of the independent wrestling scene or just the wrestling scene here as a fan in St. Louis since the independent wrestling boom kind of started, and very happy to have him here to kind of not really educate some of my listeners who from the area that aren't aware of this, but even some of my listeners that may be from other areas that don't know about all the special things that have happened in the independent scene in this area. Patrick, thanks for agreeing to do the show. Sorry for the long-winded intro. Guess I'll let you talk now.
Not a problem. Thanks for having me on.
All right, so from everybody kind of points to the indie wrestling boom, if you will, kind of beginning in late 2001 with the ECWA Super 8 tournament and then the APW King of the Indies tournaments on the East and West Coasts respectively, and from there that's where we get Ring of Honor, from where we, get uh at the time before, it kind of went out in a fiery death. Chikara and so many of these other, PWG on the West Coast. So many of these independent promotions that got a lot of national attention, were kind of based out of, New York, Philadelphia, um, and California, and I'm missing some other territories along the way, but constantly under the radar was kind of us here in the St. Louis area. And I know you've been going to independent shows since before the boom, but during the boom, uh, while all these new groups were kind of coming up, what what promotions were really standing out in here or in the St. Louis area?
Well, I got started going to shows around the spring of the year 2000, which a little over 20 years ago. It feels like forever at this point. But I mean, back then there were only a handful of promotions compared to what there is today. I mean, back then there was MMWA and SICW, who pretty much operated as a single group running out of South Broadway at the time.
Now,
Eventually,
you
uh,
mentioned South Broadway. For those that aren't familiar, what is South Broadway?
well, the South Broadway Athletic Club is in downtown St. Louis in the Soulard area. Very popular social spot in general, and I would consider it one of my favorite venues to watch a wrestling show. Very old school type of
Oh
feel
yeah.
to it, in my opinion.
And as far as MMWA, on a side note, Patrick and I have done color commentary for MMWA wrestling before the pandemic hit. So,
Absolutely.
uh, but MMWA, SICW, they have a long history because there's been quite a few names, uh, be it the Legends coming back for, a Legends night, or some rising stars who would go on to become big names in the business going through both those promotions. You want to talk a little bit about those before we get into some of the others?
Well, the obvious name when it comes to recent history would be Randy Orton. I mean, he had his first couple of matches at the South Broadway Athletic Club, and of course, due to his family, he was snatched up pretty quickly by WWE's developmental system, but that was where he started his career. So they have that little bit of claim to fame. Of
Absolutely.
course, yep. I mean, someone who is still a mainstay in this area, who has competed for WWF and WCW in the past is Gary Jackson. He's a guy who's competed on television is as an enhancement talent, so to speak, and has been in the ring with some of the all-time greats like Shawn Michaels, Rick Martel, Rick Rude, people of that caliber. Razor Ramon is another one. But he's a guy who's been all over the place. He's competed for a very long time and is still active today, at least once the wrestling shows really get going again.
Yes, sir.
As far as far as people who got started around the time that I was getting starting to go to shows, I mean, in late 2000 was when Matt Sydal made his professional debut here in the St. Louis area. He was basically fresh out of high school at the time. He was billed as weighing in at allegedly well over 100 pounds.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, very small at the time, but he was one of the first people that I ever saw do the running version of the Shooting Star Press. At the time, it was basically him and the Amazing Red. Of course, nowadays, practically every cruiserweight style of wrestler uses some variation of that maneuver, but back then he was one of the few who was doing it. So, and he was a guy who I got to see grow and learn in this area. Eventually, he branched out to IWA Mid South when they were really hitting it big in the as far as more Indiana than the St. Louis area,
Right,
but
right.
at the time they were IWA Mid South was pretty much on this close to the same level as say a Ring of Honor or an AAW in the Chicago area, and from there he went to Ring of Honor, competed for TNA Impact, and of course made it to WWE as Evan Bourne. And I say to this day that some of my coolest moments as a wrestling fan were seeing him win a championship in WWE when him and Kofi Kingston were the tag team champions,
No doubt.
and seeing him make a solo entrance at WrestleMania when he was in the Money in the Bank ladder match. So that's a very cool thing to someone who I used to see wrestle in high school gyms and armories and such places in front of maybe about 50 people at the time.
So, and we'll cycle more back to the talent later, but
Sure.
you mentioned MMWA, and how they were and still are, a driving force in the St. Louis wrestling area.
Mm-hmm.
And the obviously you got a first ballot Hall of Famer in Randy Orton, who
Mm-hmm.
had his first matches in that promotion. But there was another promotion, and this promotion unfortunately did not last, at least under this banner, in my time of being an independent wrestling fan, or at least whenever I was um, aware enough to be able to go to independent wrestling shows on my own. And this was GCW. Now, I'm
Yeah.
not as familiar on the history of GCW as you might be. Educate me and some of the other listeners about GCW.
Well, GCW was kind of my start on independent wrestling. They, I was going to Broadcast Center at the time and learning about getting into radio, which led to one of my earlier jobs in life. And while I was there, I happened to cross paths with someone who was wrestling for GCW and invited me to check out a show. That person still competes today as Ryan Ash,
Okay.
and I see him around the local shows. So that got me started going to events, and it was well, it really introduced me to, like I said, it introduced me to independent wrestling as a whole because, and it's a very different feel than going to a show in a big arena where even though you're not watching on a television and you're there live, if you're not like front row, everything still seems pretty far away.
Absolutely.
Whereas at an independent show, you're up close, you can interact a little more with the wrestlers, you can maybe talk to them at intermission
Right.
and that sort of thing. And early GCW kind of they tried to have a bit of a vibe of the original ECW at the time, that that they kind of played fast and loose with the rules. People would bring in chairs and such on a regular basis, and it was an interesting mix of characters at the time.
Well, but
And
not
go
to
ahead.
cut you off. Compare at least at that time. You mentioned GCW being almost like the original ECW. So how different was a group like MMWA compared to GCW at that time?
Well, I think I didn't really get started watching MMWA on a regular basis for until a few years after that,
Okay.
and that was mostly through their local access television show, because this was a long time before YouTube or any sort of online video became a
Right,
thing.
right, right.
So you had to find something on a local access channel that was at some random point in the night. Like I remember a couple of the shows were on like at 9 p.m. on a Friday.
Right.
So so you either stumbled upon it or someone told you when it was on. And you would see a couple of matches and they would plug the upcoming shows, and that was kind of how they got people in the door. And the main thing you say about South Broadway, they will usually pack them in there. There will
Oh,
usually be a
absolutely.
couple hundred fans. And a lot of independent promotions, even today, would kill for that sort of consistent attendance.
Absolutely.
So can't fault them for that.
No, not at all. So you mentioned GCW, and I'm not taking anything away from MMWA. I mean, obviously, I love the group. They gave me an opportunity to try color commentary there, so I do love MMWA. But GCW always, from my perspective, always had kind of this weird like mystique or lore about it. Maybe because I never got to be a part of it, but I would always hear, fans like you, other, fans from some of these shows talking about the GCW days and, oh, you would have loved the GCW days. Oh, you would have loved the GCW days. What made GCW, which stands for Gateway Championship Wrestling, which I feel like we forgot to mention that for some of the fans that don't know,
Mm-hmm.
what was it about GCW that gave it kind of this mystique that we all kind of, or that I shouldn't say we, that you guys that were there kind of look back on like this, to where people like me, people like some of my other friends that go to these shows, kind of like, kind of feel like we're talking about you know real mystical wrestling history whenever GCW comes up. What made GCW special?
Well, I think that it's kind of interesting to describe, but I think that, like I said, I think the trying to, in a way, like I said, they tried to piggyback off the vibe of ECW. That I mean, at the shows, you would hear fans chant GCW like ECW fans would chant for their promotion, and and you saw a lot of elements of ECW in the production, and there were some very politically incorrect characters in that time with
They
stuff that you would be unlikely to see today.
Well, I mean, in trying to not offend anyone, what were some of those characters?
Well, one of the main bad guys was a guy named Nicky Strychnine, who he was his whole presentation was that he was billed from the toxic waste dumps of New Jersey, and he was wheeled out in a waste barrel and would drink green liquid out of a gas can and spit it in people's faces. And
That's not so
and
bad.
yeah, but whenever he got interview time, he would go out of his way to not only cross the line but take a flying leap across it as far as offending people. He was a guy who constantly professed his hate for organized religion. He would he would trash anybody he set his mind to. I can remember the adults only shows at the time where he would walk out to the ring with a crown of barbed wire, carrying a wooden cross wrapped in barbed wire,
Oh wow.
just just kind of doing the evil messiah sort of look. So he was he was somebody who would be very difficult to describe to modern viewers, but and the weird thing was, even though he went out of his way to show what an evil character he was, he had his share of fans, people who liked the edginess that he presented.
Oh
And
no
it was
doubt.
part of that.
Just describing him to me, it's like almost. I could see him being, like one of your top baby faces in a company nowadays. Like people
Yep.
just think
And
he's that fucking metal.
yeah, I mean, he held the GCW title 4 times, more than anybody. So he was definitely one of their top guys. But given his whole promo content, he kind of had a bit of a ceiling as far as how far he could go, because you're not going to be able to say some of the stuff that he said on national television.
Right, right.
Right. But as a at that level, as a product of the times, he was a character that stood out from as far as other people from the rest of the pack, so to speak. And and at the time, GCW tried to portray itself as striking out to be different from the norm, which they saw as what MMWA and SICW was presenting, or what Rampage Championship Wrestling, another promotion at the time, was presenting, and that they were putting on the sort of product that the younger, perhaps quote unquote cooler wrestling fans would like better.
Right. So you mentioned
So,
so you mentioned him as a character from GCW. But there was a lot of characters in GCW. There was a lot of, from what I hear, like a lot of storylines that really went into GCW. I almost kind of compare to when I hear people. You mentioned the original ECW. Whenever I hear the veteran St. Louis wrestling fans at the shows nowadays talk about GCW, pardon me. Um, I kind of more feel like when they talk about, they're talking about like Matt Hardy's Omega promotion from back in the day, like just as far as innovation for the area, and then all the stars that would eventually branch out past St. Some of them, to like as you mentioned, Matt Sydal, who wrestled at a WrestleMania, wrestled for WWE, won a title in WWE, and subsequently titles in Ring of Honor, Dragon Gate, Impact, etc. Um,
uh,
but there were also ones that just kind of branched out past the St. Louis area, and I feel like you can't talk the history of independent wrestling in St. Louis without mentioning, in my opinion, you might know a few more important guys, but to me, Dingo.
absolutely, Dingo. I first saw him in, I think, the fall of 2000. And I mean, originally he was very much the Australian caricature. He brought Foster's beer to the ring, that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Take for those that never got the pleasure of seeing Dingo. What was Dingo for some of those fans?
Well, I kind of gave you the character in a
Yeah,
nutshell.
so
There
there
wasn't
wasn't
a
not,
whole
not
lot,
much more depth to it, was there?
not a whole lot, but I mean, people saw pretty quickly how talented the guy was, and he was a big part of the light heavyweight division at the time. He was in the tournament to crown the first light heavyweight champion, and he ended up being the second title holder. Makazi was the first, and he held the light heavyweight title for about 6 months, and had great matches with just about everybody, with Matt Sydal, with Billy McNeil, with just about everybody he crossed paths with. And I remember, I think it was December 2001 when his title reign ended, and it was at a place called Aggie's on South Broadway, just up the street from where the South Broadway Athletic Club is. And the place was packed for Dingo defending against Billy McNeil in a tables, ladders, and chairs match. And it was just a match that a lot of people still remember to this day. That they had a great matchup, and Billy captured the title, and Billy couldn't even celebrate his win, and he was attacked from behind by Delirious to start the next feud. So, but
That's something else
Dingo,
I was getting. No, finish talking about Dingo, please.
but Dingo, I mean, more than just being a regular competitor, he had a big hand in training a lot of the guys that came through the wrestling scene at that time period. And I mean, you talk to just about anybody who started in the early to mid 2000s, and chances are they were trained at some point by Dingo. And Dingo was trained, started his career at South Broadway before moving on to GCW, and he was trained by Gary Jackson. So that's
It's
another whole story when you go on to Gary Jackson. But
um
and Dingo unfortunately had neck problems, which is why he doesn't wrestle anymore. But and it's too bad because he was just starting. It was at that point that he was just starting to branch out more. He held the IWA Mid South title. He was starting to wrestle for Ring of Honor a bit more, but unfortunately, things kind of took a different path for him at that point. But
I do know, and this is way far down the line. He did kind of have one more final hurrah in pro wrestling with Matt Fitchett, but we're getting significantly ahead of ourselves
mhm,
there. So, you mentioned Dingo winning the title, eventually losing to Billy McNeil, and then Delirious and so forth.
mhm,
Delirious is another big name from this area, uh, and a lot of people know of Delirious because of Ring of Honor.
mhm.
But tell us about the early days of Delirious.
Well, the funny thing is, most people know him as the entertaining character, but for most of his GCW run, he was a bad guy. And when he first came in, he was immediately paired off with another person who was just starting at the time, Mischief,
Mm-hmm.
and they were a regular tag team for quite a while. And eventually there was the main heel stable in GCW was Nikki Strychnine, Delirious, Mischief, and Outcast. And they pretty much dominated everything. Strychnine was the heavyweight champion. Outcast was the light heavyweight champion. At diff- and but Delirious was, like I said, he was a bad guy for most of his GCW run. But once he started branching out, the thing was he and Matt would travel together. So in a lot of places where they were starting out, they if they needed a tag team, they would put the two of them together since they knew each other. So that led to Matt and Delirious teaming up in other promotions, and Delirious becoming more of a good guy at that point. So, and Matt and Delirious would team up a lot. They'd face each other all over the place, and like I said, eventually, like you said, Delirious eventually made his way to Ring of Honor, and he would appear all over the place. He got to wrestle in the Tokyo Dome
Mm-hmm.
due to the New Japan connection to Ring of Honor, and got to wrestle Jushin Liger over in Japan.
Yes, I've seen that
So
match. It's awesome.
absolutely, and
But
but
you alluded to it earlier. There were also two, you know, kind of what was in St. Louis slash GCW. wrestling lore, there's kind of those four pillars that really went on to do big things in the business. You know, we mentioned Seidel, who arguably went the furthest. Uh, Delirious, who went pretty far as well. But then there were two others that definitely had great careers, and they were both female wrestlers, as the Mischief and also Daisy Hayes. So talk to us about uh, Mischief and Daisy Hayes a little bit, and then we'll get on to the next portion.
All right. It was around the middle of 2000, excuse me, around the middle of 2001 that GCW's first female wrestler started competing, and it was a gal named Christine. She was only around for a few months, but her first female opponent was Mischief. So that's kind of how that started out. And Mischief faced Christine a few times, but Christine, like I said, Christine was only around a few months. So for several months, Mischief was the only female competitor in GCW. So out of necessity, she fought the guys.
Mm-hmm.
And and in that period of GCW, Mischief really normalized intergender wrestling at a time when it was something you just didn't see very often because there was no one else for her to fight. And maybe about 6 to 8 months later, when Daisy Hayes debuted, there were a lot of mixed tag team matches. Daisy Hayes was teamed up with a guy named Johnny Greenpeace, and they fought Delirious and Mischief a whole lot of times. And I would call it more of an intergender tag than a mixed tag because the men would compete with the women and vice versa.
Right.
So they wrestled each other a whole bunch. Daisy and Mischief faced each other quite a bit. And Daisy Hayes was on the smaller side, even as far as female wrestlers go. So the road was a little bit tougher for her fighting the guys. So she didn't really break out into more notoriety until she got to travel a little bit more and compete with other women, I think.
Absolutely. She
And
there she did. I remember watching a going off on a tangent, but that's what this whole podcast is about, is tangents. Uh, Seeing her wrestle Awesome Kong and actually hit a German suplex on Awesome Kong was amazing.
yeah, Daisy is very strong for her size. I mean, she worked out like crazy in order to be as strong as possible for her smaller frame. And she worked her ass off to be able to compete with the other women who would usually have a size advantage over her. And when it comes to Mischief, she competed a lot, usually against the other light heavyweights in GCW. And she actually defeated Makazi for the GCW light heavyweight title and held it for 6 months. So Mischief had her share of great matches with Outcast, with Makazi, with Matt, and
Mm-hmm.
she only lost the title in a champion versus champion match with Nikki Strychnine. So she was held in very high regard in this area. She competed on the same level as the guys, competed with the main event guys, and once she left the area, she mostly competed with other women, but she would occasionally still have the intergender matches. I remember hearing about her having a match with Eric Cannon in AAW that was really good. I'll need to see if I can
Yeah, I'll
find
have
that
to look that one
somewhere and
up.
watch it.
Um, I
And
the only thing that I mean, I think Mischief's great. Her I mean, one of her autograph pictures is hanging up in this very room we're doing the interview in.
mhm,
But one of my favorite memories of Mischief was it was at a Ring of Honor show in Carbondale, Illinois,
mhm.
and there was everybody else was just kind of in there's various wrestlers around. They're doing pictures and autographs and whatnot. There Bobby Fish and Kyle O'Reilly and Maria Kanellis and Mike Bennett were there doing autographs, and Adam Cole and all those guys were doing them. And Michael Elgin was there, And you're having to pay for all the autographs, which I get. I'm not knocking, the fact that you got to pay for autographs. That's how the
Mhm.
promotion and the independent wrestlers make their money. But to me, I was more excited about, oh, hey, Mischief, can I get to take a picture with you? And she kind of seemed like a little perplexed. She's like, absolutely. And I'm like, hey, it's good to see you again, Like, I really enjoyed all it. And she just seemed like genuinely happy that she was recognized for her work. And, and I was happy to see Mischief. So there you go. Um,
Yeah,
another thing.
Mischief and
Go ahead.
sorry,
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Mischief and that was an interesting time period in wrestling because I think it was IWA Mid South that really started pushing the more serious women's wrestling on the independent scene at the time. And a big part of it was with Mischief and Daisy Hayes, Mickey Knuckles, Lacey, Rain, people like that. And and from there, Dave Prazak, who was a part of IWA Mid South at the time, would go on to form the Shimmer promotion,
Mm-hmm.
which focused entirely on women's wrestling. And those women were a big part of that start. And
Absolutely, they were.
they they were a big part of what I call a bit of a bridge from women's wrestling just being kind of a little sideshow to being holy crap, these women can put on some great matches. And I think they were part of the path that led to what we see today as the women's evolution or revolution or whatever you prefer to call it.
Right. So we mentioned talent and breakout, or well, mentioned breakout talent and kind of the pillars, but there were a lot of guys that kind of they found their niche in here in St. Louis. You
Mm-hmm.
mentioned Billy McNeil, but there's like quite a few other talent guys from GCW that still wrestle today, but they're just kind of the St. Louis legends. What quote unquote St. Louis legends got their start in GCW? And it seems like we're focusing way too much on GCW. We're going to eventually transition to other promotions, but there's a lot of content with GCW.
Absolutely. I mean, at the time, for a period of about 5 years, they were pretty much the standout promotion and seen by a lot of fans as the best. And but I mean, you look at people who are still active today. I mean, Makazi was a big part of GCW. Now probably known as say you probably know him as Sadie Blaze these days, but he still competes occasionally. There's Outcast, who's still active with Dynamo Pro, Jackal, who's still active with Dynamo Pro, and a lot of different people who, a lot of different people competed for GCW at different points. I mean, even there was even a period of time when GCW and wrestlers from the Lethal Wrestling Alliance, which is now St. Louis Anarchy, they had some degree of working agreement, and the wrestlers competed on each other's shows, like Gary J. and Peter Abernathy, Evangelistico, and you would see those guys on GCW shows. So it was an interesting time.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the Lethal Wrestling Alliance. So, because this is something I was going to ask you about, just because I was curious. I remember when my first real exposure to St. Louis pro wrestling was
Mm-hmm.
the LWA, Lethal Wrestling Alliance, and I would hear a lot of people kind of mention that LWA kind of took over for GCW. What in the most diplomatic, terms possible, in case any of the people involved listen to this, and obviously they would know more than we would.
Mm-hmm.
What what happened to GCW, and how did LWA kind of take over that spot? And then we'll go into a little bit of the history of the LWA before the St. Louis Anarchy years.
Well, LWA started, I think, in about 2003, if I'm not mistaken. And they started from a couple of guys who started training at GCW, Adam Raw, aka Adam Castor, and Nick Tyson, who no longer competes. And And from there were a lot of guys like the guys I mentioned before, Gary J, Peter Abernathy, Evangelistico, eventually people like Dorian Victor,
Hmm.
and and LWA had a very different environment. They tried to have a party atmosphere with the fans
Right.
that they'd have that they'd have
And still kind of
comedic.
and still kind of do have that same party atmosphere to this day,
Yeah,
even under its new brand name.
right, and and they'd have stuff like funny videos between matches and stuff. They'd have bands perform at the shows, and they kind of had their own identity. And it was always an interesting dichotomy between them and GCW because to a lot of people, like I said, GCW was seen as the best, and they considered themselves the best on some level. So I think it's just a matter of personal taste, really. Different fans like different things. I mean, Lord knows I'm pretty stubborn about some of my opinions, past and present. So, but there was always a little rivalry there to some extent, and it was. And unfortunately, when it came to the working relationship, I think one side felt that the other side wasn't booking their guys strongly enough. I guess that's one way to put it. And
Gotcha,
so
gotcha.
that kind of ended the working relationship, and they kind of went their separate ways. And once GCW once GCW closed up in, I think it was either 2005 or 2006, a lot of people saw LWA as the top promotion at that point. So, and of course, over the years, there'd be a lot of different promotions. I mean, nowadays, there's just so many. I mean, you could go to a show practically every weekend while things were active. So,
Right. All right. So you mentioned that GCW did close down. From the best of your recollection, just as a fan, obviously going back in the fact that you didn't work for either promotion to have firsthand knowledge, just putting that out there as a disclaimer. What led to the end of GCW?
well, I think there was some conflict in terms of management. I mean, at the very end, a lot of people
Who
parted
promoted G-
ways with Jesus.
Who promoted GCW? I forgot to mention that earlier in the time. Who was the promoter of GCW?
The promoter was a guy who also competed at the time named Big Bad Ben.
Okay.
So, uh, uh, large guy, long dark hair. Very briefly worked with the original ECW. So I think that's where he got a lot of his mindset from, that he wanted GCW to truly be an ECW in the Midwest.
Okay. All right.
Like he had like he had hoped that they could eventually grow it to that level. Unfortunately, it never really reached that spot, but it was fun while it lasted, I'll say that much.
So it was a management thing. There was no like.
Well, like I said, toward the end, there were people thought the same spark it used to have wasn't there, and unfortunately, the conflict led to people like Dingo leaving GCW, and and Dingo went to LWA at the time,
Yeah, because that was
and
my
there were
first exposure to Dingo was in LWA.
yes, and it's like I said, a lot of people left GCW around that time, and in its final few months, there weren't a lot of people still around from the glory days, I guess you could say, and unfortunately, it reached a point where a lot of it was a rough period of time, and and I remember Ben posting about the decision to close the doors, and he talked about, because this was right around the time that both John Cronus and not long after that Chris Benoit passed away, and of course most people know the story with Chris Benoit and his family.
Right, right.
And these were people that Ben had known in person in the past, and I think that kind of hit him really hard, and that was part of the reason that, to some extent, he saw some of the writing on the wall that there wasn't enough gas left in the tank to keep it going. I think that's a good way to put it. But it was good while it lasted, and a lot of fans still fondly remember it to this day when Dynamo Pro had a GCW reunion show at the in Glen Carbon not a while back that they drew like right around 500 people there. So, and there are times when I'll wear a GCW shirt out and, and someone will see it and they'll mention it because they still remember GCW from those days. So
So definitely left a
they,
fallen legacy, and I wish I could have been a part of that legacy, but it is what it is. But one legacy of a St. Louis promotion that I was part of was the aforementioned Lethal Wrestling Alliance, the LWA, and we've spoken about it briefly.
Mhm.
After GCW, LWA kind of becomes the premier promotion, in my opinion, from the outside looking in, from a guy who traveled from the more southern Illinois area to St. Louis, to the
Mhm.
Metro East in St. Louis to see wrestling. LWA seemed like king to me, and you mentioned Adam Raw. For those that don't know about Adam Raw, tell everyone about Adam Raw.
Oh, big, powerful guy. Got an MMA background. He started training at GCW, but wasn't there for very long, so he eventually moved on. And he and Nick Tyson, who I mentioned earlier, started training, I guess, their own crop of talent who would become the core core figures of the LWA. Some of them stuck around, some of them didn't, and people who were dissatisfied with their own home promotions would move on to LWA and form more of the core roster, whether it was LWA or St. Louis Anarchy. I
well,
mean,
we'll focus on LWA for this episode. We could do a whole. I feel like we could do a whole another episode talking about St. Louis Anarchy and NWL and Glory Pro, but you know, um,
yeah, I mean, Davey Vega and Matt Fitchett both started at Dynamo, but they decided that they would go to LWA because they liked it better there.
right.
And and people like Warhorse Jake Parnell started at Dynamo. He's branching out all over the place now. So it's always really cool to see people from this area. Even just to see them on a major wrestling program is pretty cool.
Oh yeah, Warhorse had a
So,
bunch of hype going into his big match with Cody at the time of this recording a couple weeks ago.
yep. And I think that I don't know if he'll eventually be back, but I think he made a good impression. So, but I mean, nowadays there's a lot of people trying to get work in independent wrestling, and with the pandemic thing, there aren't nearly as many spots, so it's kind of tough to find stuff. I mean,
You are right
hopefully
there.
once the pandemic's cleared up and people can get regular shows going again, we'll be able to see these men and women go out there and do what they do well on a more regular basis.
Absolutely. So going back to LWA, you mentioned kind of Adam Raw. And you mentioned some of these guys that started out in GCW. Your Pierre Abernathy, Gary J, Evan Gelestico. Um, I remember
I'd say I'd say those guys are more LWA guys
right.
who would eventually work for GCW along with that.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay. So there
Mm,
was when I my first exposure to those guys were through and if you've listened to this podcast, you heard this promotion mentioned a bunch. AAPW.
hmm
They would some of the St. Louis guys would come there, to do a shot, and then I remember Gary J. He kind of saw me and Jedi, who host the weekly live show with me,
Hmm.
kind of saw us and saw us wearing like TNA and Ring of Honor T-shirts one time at a AAPW show, and he's like, hey, we have this promotion, LWA. We're bringing in Austin Aries and we're bringing in Delirious and certain things like that. They're like, ooh, that's cool for us. These are these are the hot young indie guys that we like. And
Hmm.
I remember my first show was 2000. It was the show right after the big Circus Maximus show where they had the cops called on them in O'Fallon, Illinois. But I
Oh, I
know,
remember that one. I was there.
um, but LWA was kind of had a real core roster of guys that were made themselves kind of. If GCW was the ECW of the Midwest, uh, LWA was like the Ring of Honor of the Midwest, and they had a lot of just really, really phenomenal talent. Mentioned Evan Jelestico, Pierre Abernathy, Gary J. Uh, tell those that didn't have the honor of getting to see these guys, or who are not currently having the honor because they're all still very active. Uh, tell about the aforementioned names and their characters.
Well, I mean, a lot of people would say Gary J was one of the big standouts, and it's kind of hard to believe he's been competing for as long as he has. I mean, he's been around for quite a while, like I said, and you look at the Matt Fitchett's and more. I mean, there was also Jeremy Wyatt, who's out of Kansas City, but he
Right. Oh
held
yeah,
the.
Jeremy Wyatt is. We could do a whole show about Jeremy Wyatt. Um,
Mhm. Yeah, he
he
was LWA champion at one time, and now he is currently the Gateway Heritage champion,
yeah.
which is kind of the equivalent.
Um, Jeremy Wyatt to me, I always really liked him because he was kind of MJF before MJF. You would have a crowd full of quote unquote smart marks who are all like, I know why he's a great heel, I'm here because I know how wrestling works. And he would find some way to
I
get
hate
under their
those guys.
skin. Yeah, I hate those guys too, but they think like, you can't work me, I'm gonna cheer for Jeremy Wyatt because I'm smart and I want to be different. And he would find some way to get under their skin to where they would be booing him. And
Yep.
I would. The only thing close to that I would do is I would sarcastically be like an obnoxious fanboy just to get him to heel on me even harder. Especially when he would make his way to the very, very simple crowd of AAPW. Like, I would want him to, like, just heel. Just. If he could go half Jeremy Wyatt at AAPW, he would get the fans ready to hang him. And I kind of. I don't want to say like I was too smart for my own good, but like me being kind of in on it, I'd kind of like mouth to him like, tear my sign, throw my hat, throw my hat. No, do it, do it. Oh, you want me? Like, okay. And he and he'd throw my hat and he'd throw it in my face and he'd throw my water in my face and he'd tear up my sign and he'd pour my popcorn over my head and stuff like that. And this is in like West Frankfort, Illinois, with a bunch of. I mean, they're the people that I mean, they're my people. I live in this area, but and they're here like, you see what he did to that guy? That's men. No.
Yeah, I've been
And
to
I mean,
AAPW a handful of times, usually when they were running a little closer to me. But
right. But like, for me, like, it was kind of the mutual. And Jeremy might tell you something. He might just make fun of me the whole time because that's just Jeremy for you. But like, he kind of knew. He knew I didn't care, and he knew that that would get the rest of the people pissed. So
mhm.
like, I was willing to get embarrassed a little bit by Jeremy White at the show, and he was more than willing to embarrass me, and it would get everybody around the area pissed off at him. So there's a little tangent on Jeremy White. I'd love to have White on the show if I could eventually get there. That's like the dream, but he'd probably just make fun of me the whole time. So maybe that's not a good idea.
I remember during the GCW guys, it was kind of similar with Delirious because Delirious would I would try to go up to the guardrail when he made his entrance, and Delirious would grab my Wayne's World cap that I always wear and throw it somewhere in the building.
You always
And
manage to
it's
find it at least, right?
yeah, I did, and he was. It just kind of reached the point of being a running gag that whenever I'm at a show that Delirious is on, I always try to make it up to the guardrail, and if he sees me, he'll grab the hat and throw it. So I kind of turned into practically a running gag, and like one of my old pictures is after a show of Delirious wearing the hat. So,
All
but
right.
I mean, he's a guy I've known since that time, so it's cool to see what he's been able to accomplish in his career.
So we're going back. Get tangents aside, but we're all about the tangents on this show. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so LWA, you mentioned, you know, mentioned Evan Jalestico, and this is one thing I wanted to ask you about because I bought at one of the LWA shows. I bought one of their early shows. This was a show in 2008. I bought one of their shows from 2005. And
Mm-hmm.
Evan Jalestico was doing this priest gimmick. Tell me
Yeah,
about
he was.
this.
That was, to the best of my knowledge, his original wrestling gimmick and the source of his name. It was kind of a punny name. He was the Reverend Evangelist, like evangelist.
Yeah, I kind of picked up on that, but it's like it's
So,
kind of it's one of those things. Maybe you wouldn't get if you weren't. I compare it to it's like Jeff Jarrett with the guitar or Triple H with the pedigree. If you weren't watching when they first started out to understand, like, okay, Triple H plays a rich guy, and that's why it's called the pedigree. And Jeff Jarrett
mhm,
plays a country singer, and that's why he uses a guitar. You'd be kind of wondering, like, why is this bleach blonde guy with silver trunks on using a guitar?
mhm.
So
I
it's kind of
mean,
one of those
he
things
looked.
like, one might wonder, like, why is his name Evangelistico? Like, I don't get it. And then, like, when you watch, you're like, oh, I get it.
I mean, you look at the early LWA shows and you see what these guys originally were. Like Gary J was originally Gary the Bar Now,
Mm-hmm.
and his whole character was that on some level he thought he was an animal or something, and Pierre was originally the European scumbag Pierre Abernathy, and that's why a guy from the Midwest is going around calling himself Pierre,
Right.
basically. And there were other gimmicks along those lines at that time. Of course, Dorian Victor was the $1 billion brother, so to speak.
I remember
And
that, and then I remember subsequently one of my first storylines when I got into LWA was when Dorian Victor went poor.
I do remember that. That was a while back, but I do remember that.
Yes, because that was like one of my first runs. Like Dorian Victor, like because he was like rich, and then like all of a sudden, like the next one too, like, oh yeah, he went poor, he lost all his money, and he's like begging for change, and he's
If I remember the storyline right, there was kind of a battle over who would be the authority figure in the LWA, and he backed the wrong person and bet all his money on that person. I think
gotcha.
that was how it went down. So it's kind of hard to describe, and of course, over the course of 20 years, things get a little fuzzy in my old age here. So
Well, hell,
that's why I write
even in
everything.
the
That's why I write everything down and blog it. So
well, even in the course of about 12, 13 years, it's all getting fussy for me.
yep.
So
And
we more LWA. You mentioned there was like a conflict in the LWA, and this was something that this is before I started attending shows on the regular. But I remember buying the
mhm,
DVD to it. There was this big power. There was the power struggle, and there's a lot of stuff we're forgetting in here. We could talk more about LWA, but we're gonna have Patrick back because this has been fun as hell. Just talking St. Louis wrestling and reminiscing, and we got,
mhm,
as Conrad Thompson would say, there's more meat on the bone here.
mhm. I mean, I mean, Broadway has all sorts of historical links to wrestling at the Chase. That's another whole ball of wax.
Oh yeah, we're gonna um, we got more LWA. We haven't even gotten into Glory Pro and Dynamo and subsequently Anarchy, but I feel like a good stopping point for the past is right before I started attending shows on the regular in St. Louis. There was a big
Mm-hmm.
storyline with like the two clashing philosophies of the LWA, ending in the aforementioned big brawl in the O'Fallon Knights of Columbus Hall, which saw the police getting called to the show.
Mm-hmm.
From the best of your recollection, take me through that storyline, the participants in the match, and the match itself. Because there's a lot of guys that I want to mention that were in that match, but we just haven't really gotten through to talk about them. There's the Ego Express. There's Johnny Vinyl. There's Vega was just beginning to really make his name.
Mm-hmm.
So take me through
Yeah,
that
there.
storyline to the best of your recollection as a man who was there.
Let's see. I'm cheating a little bit and going online to remember this. Remember this. It looks like it was in July of 2008,
8, yes.
and it was an eight-man street fight.
And the only reason I wanted to go to that show so bad because my friend Livewire McGuire was actually used on that show in a four-way match.
Mm-hmm. And let's see. And the main heel group at the time was the Submission Squad, which was originally the name was kind of a riff on the WWE Spirit Squad, but they were the more serious technical wrestlers. I mean, Nick Tyson was originally a member of the squad with Dingo and Pierre, but he was gone. So they brought in Davey Vega and Johnny Vinyl to fill out the group. And on the other side was Evangelistico and Gary J, or Gary the Barn Owl, and they were part of a stable with Billy McNeil called the Bearded Men from Space Station 11. And the match was Dingo, Pierre, Vega, and Vinyl against Evangelistico, Gary J, and the Ego Express, Stephen Kennedy and Casey Carrington. But the whole big one of the main rivalries within that was Carrington and Vega having a huge issue. And as you mentioned, the police were called because for a while part of the match spilled out of the building and people saw people fighting and thought there was something going on, and that's why the cops were called.
At the time, when I heard that story, I remember thinking, there's a guy wearing a ridiculous British flag outfit.
That would have
And
been Pierre.
yes, and you didn't think that this maybe would be a show, but then again, all you're doing is seeing people fighting, and God only knows what the style's gonna be. So,
Yeah.
at the time, I just tried to be a smart ass and think, why would you call the police on that? Are you stupid? But like now, in retrospect, I'm like, oh, I can very easily see why someone would call the police on that.
Yeah. Yeah, Pierre's shtick at the time was he was billed as hailing from the entire continent of Europe, and he kind of had bits and pieces of Europe in his attire. He had the Union Jack on his tights. He wore the French beret to the ring. So, like, he was taking little bits and pieces from European culture for his attire. So that's kind of where that whole thing came from. And I remember the whole street fight came down to Vega and Carrington as the final two. And
And it got even worse inside the building.
absolutely, the storyline was that Carrington's valet, Tiffany LaFane, turned on him to go to the submission squad, and Davey Vega put on a glove, lit it on fire, and punched Carrington in the face with it for the finish.
Yeah.
So that's how that turned out. But that was a pretty crazy night. I remember that very well, and I don't think I found out until a little bit after the fact that the cops were called. I just knew that the fight went out of the building at some point.
I I remember like because I just bought this on DVD.
Mhm.
They did not show what went on inside during that whole brawl outside. They followed Pierre and Evan outside, and I'm like, oh, and I kind of like wonder what kind of messed up shit was happening inside the building at this time. And then the other thing is, and this is just from the DVD release, I remember whoever the ring announcer. I don't think it was Greg Jovi at the time,
No,
um, but it was
not sure who it was.
whoever the ring announcer was kind of like a thank you for coming. It's the end of the show. You guys need to leave. I remember him saying, like, next show is such and such date, but you guys got to go.
I assume that police presence was why.
Yeah.
So I've 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 got some interesting stories about shows wrapping up very quickly. So that but perhaps that's for the next time out.
Well, we will definitely be having Patrick back because this was great. And we have so much more stuff we could cover. Just talking about this area, but I feel like that's kind of we jumped around a little bit, but this is kind of a good kind of the roots of this being grounded with MMWA, then going to GCW, and then eventually right before my fandom in St. Louis independent wrestling began with all of this. But yeah, we have
Mhm.
several more promotions we can cover. And Patrick will be back, but we want to thank you guys for having a listen. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like, share, subscribe for more content. Not just from the real pro wrestling, but from the world of comics, gaming, and all things geek culture. Go follow me on all my social media pages. Facebook.com/athleticgeek89, Twitter @athletic_geek89, and Instagram @athleticgeek89. And Patrick, I know you're a busy man. I know you've got a presence yourself. Do you have any social media you would feel comfortable plugging?
Well, I'm mostly active on Facebook and Instagram. You can search under my name, Patrick Brandmeyer, or Patrick AB7 is usually comes up right. And I'm not on Twitter very often, but I am there on Patrick AB7. If you search my name on YouTube, you'll find my channel. I do stand-up comedy at comedy clubs and bar shows in the area, so you can look at some of my comedy sets.
Absolutely.
And and especially on Instagram, I collect quite a few Transformers. I've had them since I was a kid, and you can look at some pictures of some of the more recent purchases. So I'm definitely dabble in a variety of geek culture things as well, I guess you could say.
Right on. All right. Well, I don't know when Patrick will be back, but Patrick will be back. I'll
All right.
do the Frosty the Snowman. He'll say goodbye, but don't you cry. He'll be back again someday. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time.